is safe and healthy. So far, I'm safe and healthy, and so is my wife. So we'll see. I think it's going to be a long, hot summer. Today's topic, assessing online classes, a complete tutorial. And I was amused because I sent them two titles and I had an "or" in there in my email proposal. And I think the other one was assessing something, but they wrote both. So somehow they missed that I was giving them an option. Doesn't really matter what the title was on the email. My focus today, though, is most definitely a step-by-step tutorial of what both I would suggest that you do when considering ways to assess your students at the end of the semester, and then a walkthrough of what I would do. Fortunately or unfortunately, I'm not teaching undergrads this semester. I'm just doing faculty development, but I will tell you what I do. You'll notice that I'm not on screen live. I've disabled my video. You can pretend that there's a little picture of me down there in the corner if you like, but I think these were my better days. I haven't shaved in 3.5 weeks. I look kind of like a hobo. If you saw me on the street, you probably wouldn't recognize me. So it's best if the camera just stays off today, I think. We will have time at the end. We'll open up the mics for a Q&A. And you have two choices. You could either write questions down on a sheet of paper as they occur to you, or you could post them in the chat, which, as I said, I can't see during the session, but will certainly scroll through when I'm finished with the presentation. Yes, the CV-19 virus, my goodness. What a predicament we're all in. Made doubly, triply worse by the fact that we've had minimal time to adjust everything that we do in our leap to an online teaching and learning format. It really has felt like a complex juggling act for folks as they've tried to learn the tools that they need to use, adjust their teaching methodologies, and so forth. And I mentioned in other presentations this notion of a learning curve and the so-called chasm that exists. And with any new tool, technology, technique, there are people who glom onto that early, the so-called early adopters, and then there's a transition to the mainstream. With early, late majority, and then the folks who are absolutely dragged into something new, kicking and screaming. The difficulty in crossing this chasm is usually one of tools or skills. You either need better connectivity, better computing devices, or increased skill levels to make this jump from being one of the early innovators, early adopters, and crossing that kind of gulf that prevents new technologies from being accepted quickly into the mainstream. And that's what's happened. A lot of folks currently, it feels like a juggling act. We're dropping the balls. That it's difficult to do all of these things when you have the time to plan for them. And we didn't have the time to plan for them at all. Unfortunately, for some, this is creating some negative impressions that maybe distance learning, maybe flipped classrooms are not something that they're either good at implementing or maybe good for students in the broader sense. Maybe they're environments that are not conducive to good educational practices. I would say it's too early to judge. And this article that I came across recently lended credence to that opinion, claiming that now is not the time to assess online learning. And I couldn't agree more. Because of the emergency nature of this pivot, we're not really doing online learning. We're doing remote instruction. And there was this great passage from this particular article. And I'll be quiet and take a drink while you read it. So yes, if you were feeling badly about the whole experience, I would urge some caution on your part, because you really have gotten the swimming test during a flood here in terms of adjusting to the medium and the teaching changes that are required and so forth. So this is not a well-planned, well-reasoned approach. It's more of a panic reaction, and hopefully we'll learn how to do it better. So there are certainly some among us who found this to be an oddly less unpleasant experience, maybe even an enjoyable experience. And, I'm always fond of quotes. This Shakespeare quote came to mind. And I think that for certain uh, populations among us as educators, this ability, well, not ability, this um, forced scenario of just pushing us out the door in terms of our usual approaches and perceptions can be instructive, because we do get confined by the ways that we perceive the world. And ideally, as educators, we should engage in a kind of a scientific method where we measure what we do and analyze and course correct and consistently refine our practice. Unfortunately, when we're stuck in the prisons, the confines of our perceptions, we tend to do things and then, without much reflection at all, sometimes just repeat them. So, uh, in the best sense, this pandemic crisis allows us to make lemonade out of life's lemons, in some sense, if you're familiar with that phrase, and find some good amid all of the chaos. I would liken it to if you've ever injured your arm or leg or back or something like that. I mean, that is a perfect analog for heightening your perceptions and how you get confined by your approaches. I mean, things that you used to take for granted when your arm is in a sling become very difficult, and you have to adjust your whole approach to everyday matters. And it's surprising how difficult some of the things can actually be. So, uh, yeah, for me, the upside is that there are some surprising realizations possible if you take a closer look at what you're doing. For example, and clearly this is a Photoshop piece, there's no board that's that tall without a ladder, but one of the perceptions that you're forced to re-examine just by the pivot to online learning is the way that you teach in person. And maybe some of those approaches that you rely on as a reflex action are not necessarily the best approaches that you could have chosen. Similarly, with the way we evaluate our students' learning, maybe the pivot to online learning will allow us to examine our testing practices and reevaluate them and conclude, as many have emphasized for quite a long time, that traditional evaluations like multiple choice questions and things are not the best. And one of the things that maybe you'll agree with me, and I wish we could open all the mics and chat, but we'll do that later, is that uh, the pivot to online instruction has highlighted something that I've realized for many years, not at first when I began teaching, but I would say, I don't know, 5, 6 years after I started, I realized the primacy, the singular importance of communication in teaching. It doesn't matter what subject you're teaching, focusing on being a good communicator is, I don't want to say half the battle, but a significant portion of a good teacher's skill set. Similarly, the pivot to online learning may have exposed to you the value of building community. Meeting students in class every day, you tend to overlook the community aspects of this, everybody coming together and exchanging ideas. But I've taught online courses since 1995, off and on, and I'm always surprised to see how some students, enjoy interacting online, sharing ideas in ways often very much different to the way they would interact in class. Maybe you've discovered this as well. So the finish line is approaching, as they say. And we have to think about ways that we can assess students because assigning grades is just something that we need to do. I read with interest, as perhaps you did as well, that many colleges around the world have adopted a pass-fail grading system this year, simply concluding that it was unfair to grade students and impossible to grade them even well. Um, I wish that we'd done that. We seem to be in a letter grade mode still, but it's not the end of the world. We can still stick the landing, as they say. Maybe you're familiar with this phrase. Uh, I've heard it used in the complex gymnastics moves that people make. You know, they're doing something, and then when they land well, there's that notion of glee, elation on their faces. So that's what I want to do. I want to take this juggling act that we're all engaged in and stick the landing. Our students want to do this as well. This cannot have been an easy experience for many, despite some perhaps finding that they enjoy learning online. Uh, the limitations of these face-to-face video conferences are significant. They've got kids perhaps running around home, as we do as well. And our students want to stick the landing. They want to end the semester as successfully as possible. So I've gotten some email from people over the past couple of weeks asking essentially this question, and we'll talk about that in a bit. We have posted some resources I want to call your attention to on the CETL webpage. And one of them is called Remote Learning Tools and Resources, and breaks out help files for all of the various tools that the QU community is using. But I want to focus your attention on the Guide to Evaluating Students in the upper left. And don't make the mistake that I do. For some reason, I'm pretty computer knowledgeable, I like to think, but I was talking with Dr. Hussam Aldaman, the director of the CETL the other day, and he was sharing his screen, and here I am foolishly trying to click on screen that's shared and wondering why it's not responding. So of course this is a presentation and you can't go and click on the screen. Maybe you're smarter than I am, I don't know. But in that subsection, we've got some great resources. If you haven't seen these already, there is the Best Practices Guide to Evaluating Students there at the top, and I'll explain a little bit more about this today. There's an English and Arabic version, and then some fantastic faculty from around the university have volunteered to do presentations focusing on ways that they suggest or implement assessments with their students. That is an expanding list. If you have some expertise you'd like to contribute, these are generally short videos, 5-10 minutes. Mine never tend to be short, you know that. But I recorded a couple of them, and we got to get this viewership up. This is only 106 views. I'm not going to get any Google, YouTube ad revenue. I need at least 1 million views, please, so get on that. I'm just kidding, but you can indeed see some presentations that myself and others have made. So I mentioned this best practices guide, English and Arabic, and that's at the top of the screen. There is the address if you'd like to go to it, but you can find the CETL webpage, I'm sure. So in that guide, I talk about several methods that, and I'll come to each of those in turn. So I said, people have been asking me, what would you do in your classes? Really, what they want to know is, what should I do in my classes? And so I'm going to try to answer both. You are faced with a path with a variety of decisions. These decisions are often interrelated. If you choose one side, then that leads to other decisions. And you kind of go around in this complex web of decision making. And I'm going to try to navigate that for you today, one decision at a time. So, the first question that I would ask you to ask of yourselves is, what do you have time to do in your classes? Astoundingly, Ramadan is coming next week, and that's going to change things yet again. So, time is limited. One of those linked questions: what do you have the skill to do in your classes? And I don't mean the skill as an educator. I'm sure you're well skilled there. I'm talking about the technology skills involved. Can you climb this learning curve if you have not done uh, particular testing methods before? So we'll talk more about those in a bit. Decisions abound. Implicit in the way that you intend to craft an evaluation for your students at the end of the semester is what ways have you been teaching? What have you been teaching to your students? How have you been teaching that? Have you been, if you've attended my other presentations, you certainly recognize Bloom's taxonomy. Are you teaching at the knowledge level where students are remembering things? Or are you ascending that pyramid regularly and engaging students in ever more complex cognitive tasks? So you need to be realistic about where you are in your teaching of your students. How have they been assessed in the past? It's generally a good guide. If this were a normal semester, would this look like your final exam? Do you teach in a way that reinforces memorization? If this is a slide that you use from your class, you'll notice it says memory is gained on chips connected to the system board. Well, that's telegraphed to students because it's in bold. And then a test question from such a class might look exactly like this. And this was a publisher provided test question from those very materials. So your students cannot jump right up to difficult questions, evaluation, essay questions, and things if they are used to a steady diet of knowledge and comprehension level activities. And you need to be realistic with yourself in that regard when considering the assessment methods you'll use. So another question relates to the last one. As I said, this is a web. What are your students capable of? Well, they're capable of many things. They're capable of very sophisticated thoughts, but that capability is intimately tied to what they're used to, what they're practiced in. So, have they been thinking critically? Have you emphasized these various aspects of the learning experience, or is it more of a memorization task in your classes? And I'm not criticizing or anything, but being realistic at this point is extremely important. We can be aspirational later. So, what are your students used to? Because if this is the type of test that they are used to taking, and now you decide that you're going to have a question that says, let's evaluate the merits of these two different approaches and write me an essay, of course, that may be well outside their ability to answer successfully simply because they haven't practiced these things. And you'll recall from my talks about Bloom's taxonomy that this is a progressive scaling of the pyramid. It's not something where you just jump to the top level. Students need practiced and led up in phases. So I couldn't say it better than practice makes perfect. If you intend to do these more cognitively complex things in an evaluation, then prepare your students for that. Even then, it's so late in the semester that a lot of advanced preparation may not be possible, or if it is, it may not be effective. You really need to be honest about the way that you've taught students and how they expect to be evaluated. As I said, this is not some place where you should let aspirations and wishful thinking unduly influence you. So there's still more questions. Do you know how to use a grading rubric? If you've heard about this but never used one, then uh, essay questions, whether your students can do them or not, may not be a possibility because you may not have the experience grading well. Grading rubrics are essential. You can't just rely on your intuition to say that's a good answer, that's a bad answer. Uh, you need to be honest about your ability to grade uh, higher level questions correctly. Um, as I said, it's just a maze of things, but hopefully we'll navigate it here. Uh, no matter what type of evaluation instrument you choose, how could additional test even be conducted under these circumstances? Well, that's another choice. And you need to know the difference, if you don't already, between synchronous and asynchronous environments. Synchronous environment, everything happens in a synchronized fashion at the same time. In an asynchronous environment, time takes on a different meaning. It's expanded. So a synchronous activity, everybody is doing the same thing at the same time. They're all sitting down to take a test from 12 to 2. Doesn't have to be in the same location. This could be online. But a synchronous online test, like a synchronous online class session, takes place but in a certain time frame on a certain date. An asynchronous activity is more free form. Think of kids on a playground doing whatever they want during recess. So an asynchronous test would have a different time horizon. It could be given all day Tuesday. Students could take a test when they were available that, or it could even be expanded further. Instead of a test on a day, perhaps it's done all week. Logical question, what about cheating? Will students cheat? Yes. I don't see any scenario. There are certainly well-intentioned efforts at mitigating cheating. People have talked about getting students to sign an honor code that recognizes that they're people and that we're all in this together. That's great. If you feel that such an approach would work, by all means, pursue it. But I think that we should just expect that students will cheat. And going forward from that expectation, it's incumbent upon us as educators to look for ways to minimize that cheating. So acknowledging that is a very real possibility despite our best efforts to avoid it, there are some logical conclusions. Oops. That depending on the way that I taught, what my students were capable of doing, one way to minimize cheating would be to put a time frame around the test, that they need to take it between a certain set of hours on a certain day. Could students still communicate by phone during the test? Sure, there's no way that we can guard against that. Uh, they could have other computers open while they're taking a test. All of this notion of lockdown browsers and things is completely out the window. They could even have a brother or sister or tutor sitting right next to them as they're taking an online test. So there are virtually no ironclad anti-cheating methods that I can think of that will be effective 100% of the time. But doing an online test where the questions are randomized, where there is a specific time frame, has certain advantages in helping to mitigate academic dishonesty. I'm not saying that you should all go for this approach, but we're just exploring options. If that sounds appealing, then you need to ask yourself more questions. How much time do you have to create such a test or multiple tests? And what's your skill level at doing that? I mentioned this adoption chasm that exists for any new tool or technology, and online testing is no exception. There is a steep learning curve, and I liken it to building a web page. If you have designed your own web page from scratch, this won't seem very difficult. But the behind the scenes, and this is web page design, the behind the scenes process to building a web page is a technically complex one. So those of you who have done online testing in the past and created them are at a distinct advantage if you choose to do an online synchronous testing activity. If you've never uh, done an online test, you are unskilled at this, and you will need a lot of time to become skilled enough. There may be support networks in your colleges, in your departments. I know that chemistry has a fantastic resource person who has prepared videos and online tests and things in the past, so they are well prepared. The CETL has done workshops these past several weeks, and videos are online about online testing. Uh, but you need to seriously assess your skill level. And the matrix that I always use is that I try to avoid things that are high effort and relatively low value. And I look for instead, oh, I'm sorry, things over in that top left quadrant. I want things that are easy for me and valuable, not in a monetary sense, but in an educational sense. So rather than create hundreds of multiple choice questions, that's a high effort, low value activity. I would look for an alternative. And I said before, practice makes perfect for students doing various questions, whether it's multiple choice or essay questions. It definitely applies here as well. If students have not done online tests before, they will have that same chasm and learning curve to overcome. And even a well constructed online test on your part may cause problems for students. And there is nothing worse. I've certainly done this in the past, and I've been saddened by it, where you're giving an online test and there are network outages, computer problems in the students, and they can't finish. They can't even start perhaps an online test, or it freezes halfway through something. And then that's additional work on our parts to mitigate. So the learning curve exists for them as well. So uh, think very seriously about these various factors when considering doing online tests. And I'll talk more about them, but you may decide that this is not a viable option. And you may be in search of lower tech approaches. This is just in there for fun to lighten the mood. I like wireless keyboard. So, what are some of the choices if you're looking for a lower tech approach? Well, instead of an online test, instead of a multiple choice test that is done in a synchronous fashion, going for that low effort, higher value quadrant, returns taxonomy. And if students have been practiced in this, avoiding lots of low level knowledge questions and creating fewer but higher value analysis, synthesis, and evaluation oriented questions shows promise. So something, if my students are capable of doing this, if your students are capable, write an essay comparing, that is a super low effort on your part, high value question. And we said before, you need to know how to use a grading rubric. So these are these interconnected questions. I tried to walk through all of the things that you would encounter as you're pondering what to do in the next few weeks. The big question, I said, as people asked, what would I do in my classes? And I think they're just asking this as kind of a fact check to see their own intuition is correct, which is great. Uh, if you've been attending my presentations, and I don't pretend to have all the answers, I have some, but certainly not all. But if you've attended my presentations in the past, many of you have, you've adopted some of the approaches I've suggested, and things like Bloom's taxonomy and uh, et cetera, are familiar to you. Chances are these have infused themselves into your teaching by osmosis. You've picked up some of this stuff. And so I would suspect that for those of you who are doing similar things, this is not business as usual, but it's more calm than panicked, and that you can see the light in the distance, perhaps better than someone who's been teaching in a more traditional fashion, because you have been doing this kind of self-analysis, and you have been engaged in this feedback process where you're constantly fine-tuning your approach. And you're already near this quadrant yourselves. So the best practices guide that Dr. Hussam and I contains our amalgamated best practices approaches. And I use all of these on a regular basis and have talked about them in various presentations. So they should certainly be familiar to you. I've never used debates or student portfolios, so I wouldn't consider those as possible assessment options. But as I said, business as usual. I always do high and low stakes assessment. And if you do as well, you are well positioned here for the end of the semester, because you can do several lower stakes assessments for students. I would personally adopt a two-phase approach to assessment. That would consist of some sort of traditional test, modified for the current remote education environment, and I'll talk about that specifically. But I also would definitely include a final project, which I do typically anyway in my undergraduate classes. Let's talk first about a test. My tests are lower stakes. I give quizzes throughout the semester, sometimes dropping the lowest one or two lowest ones. The final exam is not a high stakes endeavor in my classes. It is higher stakes than the individual quizzes, but not 50% of the grade. You'll notice that that is for the project. So I talk about these skills all the time, and that's what I stress when I teach. So my students are used to doing a range of activities across the Bloom spectrum. So I'm not likely to give a lot of multiple choice tests anyway. So that's good. I'm not even likely to test online, so I'm not going to consider it in my class if I were teaching. This is a lot of effort and low value for me. So I would also, in an online environment, not be tempted to give a synchronous test. I would if I were on campus. I do my tests on paper. I like that ability for students to write. I always have essay questions, etc. But now in the distant learning environment that we're engaged in, I would not do a synchronous test personally. I would emphasize this quality over quantity that I've been talking about. I might have a few multiple choice questions, and this is from an old test of mine. There are only 10 of them. They're 2 points each. That's a little bit of work on my part, and it is low value, but it's not a lot of low value work. Instead, I would look for ways to leverage higher value questions, short answer questions, getting students to activate those problem solving and critical thinking skills, writing and explaining. These type of questions, and this is a longer essay question from a past introduction to IT test of mine, these are more difficult to cheat on. And if somehow students were to cheat, and I've only ever done this in an in-class setting, synchronous one. But envisioning students getting this online and somehow communicating, I can't imagine that they would be very good at altering the language. If what did you write, and you tell me, and I'd basically, I would envision students copying it largely word for word, which would make similar responses very easy. Well, no, I said that maybe too easily. I think it would make spotting similar responses easier. So, minimizing cheating by uh, making the questions more difficult to cheat at, not controlling the testing environment, but controlling the content of the tests itself. Themselves. Notice I've dimmed that check or that X because I'm not eliminating cheating. I don't have any illusions that I am. I'm trying to minimize it. I would additionally adopt a asynchronous testing format, perhaps all day Tuesday, perhaps all week. I recognize that this chasm exists, especially if my students were not used to taking online tests in the past. I would use Blackboard, not for an online test in Blackboard, but I would distribute the test and I would accept submissions through Blackboard. And I would do it just by a Word document. Here's the test. It's going to be available for download on Blackboard, and then you submit it back to me on Blackboard. You could print it and write on it, you could scan it, or you could just stay in Word and highlight things and type the answers right there. I would have students submit the Word document through Turnitin, and we could spot plagiarism perhaps that way as well. So why would I do that? Why wouldn't I construct an online test? Well, that's a bit of work, and I'm lazy. Well, not lazy, but I want to concentrate on things that I think are more important, which are the different levels of learning, instead of simplistic questions. I'm much more interested in students thinking critically. There is a danger that if they are not used to this, as I've said 20 minutes or so ago, that there's going to be some bad feelings. You can't just drop these more difficult tasks on students. But there's an additional aspect that I want to call your attention to. I said that practice makes perfect. This is why I would include a final project as well. I would not rely just upon a final test. And excuse me for the practice makes perfect part. I can't see the next slide, so my brain got a little fried there, and I'll get back to what I was thinking. I see the slides on my screen as you do. What would I consider for a final project? Some sort of creative work. It's possible to envision students doing a presentation, making an audio recording, a video recording. They could narrate and record a PowerPoint presentation. They could submit a written work. There could be a computer programming project if you're a computer programming teacher. There could be some poster session. There could be an architecture model that's created. The creative works that students could generate for a final graded project are many. They're limited only by your imagination. In a project, it could be due at any time during the month of May. They could have a much more expanded window to submit it. If you're doing projects, and this is what I was thinking of before when I had the caution sign, we need to grade those things consistently. There needs to be a rubric. I'll highlight that. They're essential. Rubrics are essential because we don't want students to become angry. This is a rubric that I developed for a programming project, and the details aren't important, except in the fact that every aspect of the project had a point value assigned. And there were ways that we assessed this very deeply. So you need some similar sort of rubric if you are planning on doing a final project. So Those are high value, relatively low effort. The rubric takes time to create, so there's a little bit of high value, high effort in there, but it's worth it to me. Let's talk about grades, because this is where the possibility exists for some unpleasantness. When we're grading, we need to be fair, we need to be standardized, and the grades need to be defensible. I would say that this whole experience has been unnerving enough for not only us, but for our students, that we should expect complaints from across the educational spectrum. Oh, the class wasn't well taught. Why did I get a B? I did better than this. I had problems. There were problems with the technology, whatever. So when we assign final grades, I have some special considerations that I would take in. I do want the grades to be defensible. If a student complains, I need to show how I determined a final grade, especially on a project. So that's where the rule comes in. I would grade more easily, more leniently than in a traditional course, in an effort to acknowledge the fact that we pivoted very quickly. And there have been some special limitations on not only the way we have to teach, but the way our students learn. Importantly, I would try to recognize any measure of reasonable effort on the part of my students. If a student is participating, trying, even though it may not be what I expect, if there's a good faith effort, I would do my best to reward that when it came time to grading. Similarly, we don't want to just give everybody an A because that'll be setting up problems for future courses. If you get from, you know, uh, chemistry level 1 to chemistry level 2, don't have the requisite knowledge, that's a problem for all of us next year teaching that secondary course. So if a student has not made sufficient progress, I think we are duty bound as educators to indicate that clearly. So it's a juggling act, as I said. We want to do these things all well, or as well as we possibly can. So decisions. I have one more decision to think about, and it's kind of a chilling thing. This is just from yesterday. And you can't have missed, well, maybe you can, since it's only from yesterday, but certainly it must have occurred to you what happens if they don't solve this pandemic issue soon. And it looks like we may well not. So many universities are already crafting contingency plans for a fall semester and possibly even a winter semester that are still conducted online. If that's the case, we need to do some important things now. As we are engaging in all the stuff we're engaging in this semester, and as we wind down, we need to look back at what's happened. You need to keep that logbook that I've spoken of in past presentations. What did you do that went really well, that you may need to use again and expand upon in the fall? What did you do that shouldn't be done again? What best practices did you discover that you could contribute to the CETL? How could you, if you listened early presentation and you realized that you were doing too many knowledge level things, how could you change your courses in the fall so that you do less of them and that you focus on this full spectrum of the cognitive realm? And then, if indeed we all are teaching online again in the fall, you can be calmer because it'll be more business as usual for you because you will have anticipated it rather than being surprised. So that's a lot of talk. Thank you so much. You can send questions to the CETL main address and they will be parceled out to us, or you can send them to my uh, traditional address, just chris.stryker. I said there'd be time for Q&A at the end. Let me get out of Keynote, thankfully. Let me get back to the screen. Okay, I am here. And as I said, I won't turn on my camera because I look kind of like a homeless person. But if there are questions, please unmute your mic and let's have a chat. Well, I do have a question for you then, which you should always have in reserve. What are some of the thoughts that you are having? What approaches have you adopted in these past couple of weeks in terms of intermediate assessments, formative rather than summative assessments? Can anyone share things that they've done in the recent past? We don't have the option to unmute. Let's see if I can grant you that option. I don't think I'm in control, but let's see. Session settings, share audio. There you go. I guess I do have that control. Thank you. Was that Lily who said that?
Yes, thank
Yeah,
you. I
yes,
love
I do.
multiply.
You can teach an old dog new tricks, I guess. Yes. What were you going to say, Lily? Hi.
Oh, hi, Chris. Hi. Actually, I was just going to say thank you, and you've really confirmed, thankfully, a lot of the